And I've got 5 questions at the moment, each of which has a lot of sub-questions, and maybe they're research areas. But I also think they're ones that this group and this ever-widening network of people might want to think about. And my first question is quite simply, how are deals initiated upstream? I think, as many have observed, okay, lack of transparency, there are often some very murky black boxes going on around the new politics of investment in deals of all kinds. They're things that happen in boardrooms, in investment fora, in market arrangements that aren't really markets. Sometimes they're cartels, sometimes they're networks that we don't really know very much about. And I think it's time we started to open those things up. And this goes beyond simply calls for transparency. I think it requires a kind of investigative journalism. It probably requires some insider observation. It requires some research of a really quite imaginative kind. But as long as we go on simply treating the ways these deals actually happen as black boxes, I don't think we're going to get very far. Now, part of that opening up has to be around...
Sorry, there's a big garbage truck outside competing with you.
Okay, I will shout, all right. Part of this opening up has to be a hard look at the politics and the sociology of imagination, of speculation, of creation, of motivation that's happening in these black boxes. It's clearly not simply a question of market arrangements. This can't be reduced to economics. We've got to look at the interplay of political interests, of economic interests, but also of discursive possibilities. What are the new possibilities and imaginations of commodities, of what might work as a deal, that are being negotiated in these fora? And that requires a kind of almost ethnographic approach to what's happening. And we also have to think about this in current political, economic and moral times. And this is where I think the Rio vignette is quite telling. Because we are at a moment where we've not only got a particular phase of crisis capitalism and of coming together of environmental, of financial, of food and other crises, which are generating new imperatives for capital to land in particular places, for ways in which finance needs to place itself in the world, which is clearly part of what's going on in deals. But we're also in this post-Rio moment of green economies, green economy thinking, and indeed to add to Yun's remarks about the other meetings that are going on as we speak, there are at least 2 others that I know about that are busy plotting out the post-2015 framework for what should follow on from the Millennium Development Goals and what should be the content of the Sustainable Development Goals that were at least argued for in that rather toothless Rio Outcomes document. So what might be the place of deals, land grabs and so on, and contestation around them in those kind of fora? So that's about how deals are being initiated upstream and what shapes them. My second big question is how are land and nature being reimagined in these processes? Or perhaps, as Jessie suggested, a whole range of other things too. What we're clearly looking at, and I think much of the work already of this group and beyond has shown, is that we're seeing some quite fundamental transformations often of socially and ecologically embedded processes into services, commodities, offsets, symbols of global morality of various different kinds. The language of fictive commodities and a real interrogation of those concepts, I think, could be really, really useful here. But I think also we need to look hard at how different imaginaries and different imaginings and conceptualizations of land and nature are articulating with and contesting each other. The ways in which global ideas of natural capital, for instance, are landing in and being renegotiated and contested as they run up against very, very different ways of living and thinking about land, resources, processes, ecologies, socio-economies. So that's about reimaginings. My third question is, who are the brokers in these deals? And this is really thinking about how this black boxed upstream, conceptual, somewhat murky world of imaginings lands on the ground, but intermediated in all sorts of complex ways. Now, in the deals I've seen unfolding in the parts of West Africa where I work, there's an interesting rise of agents and intermediaries and a new category of kind of knowledgeable local actor who are becoming quite critical as key to enabling big deals up here to land on the ground. And I think there are some interesting questions to be asked about the social identities, the emergent social categories, the opportunities to be a new kind of global elite, perhaps, emerging in this frame. But it's not only individuals, it's also about new intermediary firms, the rise of new industries, for instance, of firms brokering new kinds of carbon deals and commodity deals, doing the sorts of evaluation and accounting and navigation through new complex protocols, which are necessary to link real people and places up with the often quite bizarre workings of new schemes to value land and nature and make them investable and make them make profits for some. I think this is a category of actor, company to explore, and I think crucial to that would be to look at the ambiguities and tensions in allegiance, in positioning, in interests that they may become part of. My fourth question is, what landscape pathways do deals interlock with? Now clearly, as we know, there are long histories of enclosure, of efforts to control and commodify landscapes and land and livelihoods, which are part of the creation of conditions of possibility for the new generation of enclosures we're seeing now. Those conditions are partly material. They're to do with the regulatory arrangements and the vulnerabilities of people and places to being appropriated. They're also discursive conditions of possibility. They're things like the blame to peasants for destroying environments which justifies their replacement with new kinds of external custodians. Other often quite familiar narratives and discourses. But I think there are some interesting questions to be asked about how today's sometimes quite new justificatory narratives and new procedures, things we see very much in the world of the green economy and the new arguments about ecological justifications, but also in those around food and around land and around efficient use of resources, which are landing in and often re-invoking older discourses with new spins, and new spins on who's responsible for what, in ways which are enabling grabs. But also under this theme, I've become very interested in the unruliness of landscapes. And by landscape, I mean those intertwined arrangements of ecologies, of people, of relationships, which often don't obey the neat formulae either of, in the cases I've often looked at, green market arrangements, or indeed of deals initiated by markets and investors, and sometimes by states. Things on the ground are simply more messy and more unruly than those who would like to invest in them and grab them often realise. So is that unruliness of landscape itself a kind of counter-politics? A kind of counter-politics which is just providing kickback and resistance in its own way, and how is that working? And my fifth question I've phrased as, when is a grab not a grab? Now, we're at a moment where I think this debate, this fantastically exciting and perhaps nothing more important than this debate about land grabbing that's happening, is already maturing. And it's matured very, very fast. I mean, it's only been around for a few years in its contemporary form, and yet we've reached a point where it is maturing. And where clearly what we're dealing with is a long-standing historical process, but also a very fast-moving contemporary dynamic. I think we're perhaps at a moment in this conference where we could begin to say and to ask, is the term land grabbing or resource grabbing an analytical category, and a very useful analytical category, or is it an emotive catch-all? Perhaps it's both. There is clearly an emotive content to this. And that's been part of what's driven and is driving the activist content of this debate. But as this debate matures, what does the term grabbing reveal? And what might it obscure? Do we need perhaps to think about some better typologies of different kinds of grabs in different places, or political moments and contexts in which that term grabbing is useful, and perhaps when it's less useful or might switch off those we want to have as allies? A related question could be put as simply, is justice compatible with land and resource deals? And I've been asking myself quite hard in the aftermath of the green grabbing work, which, or that initial special issue, which did attract quite a lot of attention. A number of the journalists who interviewed me after that said, so are you saying that market-based mechanisms for environment should be thrown out, or are you saying they need to be reformed? And I think it's a question that runs across the whole debate that we're dealing with. Are we always dealing with a radical agenda which says basically capitalist mechanisms aren't the nature of our economic and social systems? Or are we talking about ways in which we might tweak these investments and deals to make them work better for people on the ground and reduce forms of dispossession and create greater justice in deals? Now, it might be both in different places, but I think that is actually quite a critical question. And it's a very important question for the style of engaged research and activism that we're dealing with. When is a grab not a grab? And when is a reformist argument valuable? And when do we actually need to go fully radical? And what are the contexts and places in which those intellectual and activist strategies might be appropriate? So those are a few starting points.